So Riverdale is a thing. Full disclosure, I don't like Riverdale, and I actually haven't seen a lot of it, but don't worry, this isn't going to be one of those YouTube videos criticizing the bad writing, inconsistent characters, or frankly jaw-dropping plot points. Don't get me wrong, I'm going to talk about those things, they're a pretty integral part of the show's makeup, but I'm not going to sit here for the next however many minutes and tear down something that people like. I have never and will never do that. I remember when Riverdale first came onto the scene all the way back in 2017. A few people I know were talking about this darker remake of the Archie characters, and I was intrigued. I'd read some of the Archie comics while visiting some of my older relatives, and I watched the animated series Archie's Weird Mysteries, which was like a less weird version of Martin Mystery. Ooh, I should do it. This is a thing on Martin Mystery. And I thought a new take on these characters might be really welcome. I found out later that there have been several reboots in comic and graphic novel form that have really done some neat stuff with the characters, and one of them Riverdale was loosely adapted from, but I mean like really loosely. Like tenuous at best. Anyway, I sat down one day and I thought I would give it a shot, and I was wholly underwhelmed. I clawed my way through the first episode and it was a slog. At least for me, but I'm aware that I'm not the intended audience. From that point on, I had a lot of disdain for anything to do with the show. Unlike something which I don't enjoy but respect, like horror movies, I can at least see the appeal even though it's not for me, but I had a really hard time doing that with Riverdale. So why devote a whole episode to a show that I neither enjoy nor watch? Well, Riverdale as a phenomenon is actually quite interesting. I don't think anyone would suggest that its writing is good or even passable by most standards, but if you love it, then fucking go for it. I am not one to tear others down. I have long been an advocate for the idea that there's no such thing as bad art, and Riverdale being a TV show is of course art. Does that mean it's beyond criticism? Never. And again, I think even the most diehard fans would still hurl criticism at the show. They may even be the ones to say the most and have the best arguments. But despite all of the negativity, Riverdale is still super popular. It boasts some of the highest audiences on both television and Netflix and is arguably the CW's most successful show to date. People clamor for and crave the show's outlandish antics and character drama, and that has me intrigued. Because there's no such thing as bad art and I'm generally interested in television, that means I'm also interested in Riverdale and why it's so popular. And I think that comes down to how the characters are presented, how the show fits into its contemporary television landscape, and the ever blurrier definition of what a serial drama is. Despite the apparent lack of proper craft and artistry on the surface, I think the series creator and showrunners know exactly what they're doing. And so today, I want to talk about Riverdale. Apparently, the idea for a live-action version of the Archie characters has been a thing for a long time, because rumor has it some creatives at Fox floated the idea as far back as 2012. Although at this point the idea was to create a movie adaptation, which supposedly got as far as meetings to decide direction and tone, before the executives decided that they wanted to focus resources on larger budget films, likely to compete with the success of Disney and Marvel. However, a lot of work had already gone into the project, and so they shifted focus to try for a TV show based on the concept. And the CW took over production and officially ordered a pilot in 2016. Because it's a CW show, all of the filming, production, and post-production are all done in Vancouver, Canada, and the nearby Fraser Valley. But the aerial shots of the town are pulled from archival footage from Gilmore Girls. The cast consists of a large number of young actors, though none of them are close to high school age. Although many of them had previously worked in film and television, Cole Sprouse was arguably the most well-known for his shared role on Friends and The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody with his twin. The show then began airing in 2017, and the CW brokered a deal with the streaming giant Netflix to distribute the show internationally, with episodes added weekly to the service the day after they aired on the CW. This proved to be a smart decision because the show launched to almost instant popularity as fans watched when it aired and could indoctrinate their peers with episodes they might have missed. Plus, I'm told many people wait for the whole season to finish before watching because they prefer to binge it when they're in the mood for Riverdale's unique brand of incredulous storytelling. As I've said, I don't enjoy the show despite finding it an interesting case study, and while I have seen more of the show while doing research, my summary is still probably going to be heavily skewed and highly inaccurate, so here's your sort of spoiler warning. Summer is coming to a close, and Archie Andrews will be heading back to school with his best friend Jughead and the perfect girl next door, Betty Cooper. Archie is interested in a music career, but is afraid what his father might think. Betty seems very enthusiastic about Archie's new muscle mass after he spent the summer working for his father's construction company, but she isn't the only one, as the new girl Veronica Lodge is also very interested in the seemingly perfect Archie, who actually isn't perfect at all, and the two leading ladies will have to take a back seat because Archie's busy shacking up with his music teacher, Miss Grundy. To top it all off, the whole town is shaken to its core after the disturbing disappearance and subsequent discovery of Jason Blossom, who has been murdered. And everyone in town is a suspect. Is it the weird outsider Jughead?
In case you haven't noticed, I'm weird. I'm a weirdo. I don't fit in.
The perfectly mannered girl next door harboring a secret.
Betty couldn't make it, so she sent me instead.
The new girl whose parents are tied to the mafia, Jason's twin sister, or even Archie himself. Who is lying? Who is innocent? Whose secret will be exposed? And more importantly, who cares really? Because the show also has a bunch of other plot lines after the murder, like Betty becoming a child pornographic webcam girl, Jughead inheriting a biker gang / drug cartel, and a knockoff version of Dungeons & Dragons that might possibly be forcing people to commit suicide and was created by the evil head of a group of nuns or possibly the aforementioned biker gang leader before Jughead. I don't know. Does anyone know? Seriously, does anyone really know what's going on in this show? You'll have to pardon my incredulity here, but the plot is so hard to follow because it changes apropos of nothing and is so inconsistent that I have whiplash after every episode. And don't get me wrong, that's not a bad thing because this is precisely what makes the show so great. One of the biggest criticisms the show gets from detractors and even from its fans is how infuriating the characters are. This usually comes up in one of two ways. These are nothing like the characters from the Archie comics, and why are these characters so inconsistent? These complaints actually play into one another, but I'll start with the first one. I don't actually think that these characters are from the Archie comics, and although that's just my opinion, I don't think that's a hard argument to make. The Archie characters have been rebooted and reimagined before, but for the most part these characters are largely established, and that's important, and we'll come back to that, but these characters in Riverdale are not really the same as their comic book counterparts, besides the fleeting visual similarities and names. And yes, you could say that this reimagining is a betrayal of the source material, but I don't actually think that's true at all, and that has to do with how the show is presented, and by extension how the characters in the show are presented. From the get-go, this show is given to us in a Twin Peaks-esque way. Because the show was created by the CW, it has a certain kind of feel to it. You know the feeling I'm talking about, that slightly campy, somewhat darker, dramatic view of reality. You see this in the superhero shows and especially in their dramas. There's this dark, slick veneer that has been placed over the town. In the first couple episodes, the show draws attention to this loss of innocence that the town of Riverdale is experiencing because of Jason's death. This, along with the surrealistic pseudo-retro aesthetic for the setting, with the brooding melodramatic mood of the show that is ever present and seems to even affect the filter choices and how it's shot. It all seems to scream out, this isn't the Riverdale you thought you knew. It's darker and sexier. But really, it's altogether just not Archie and his friends. To be a little cynical for a minute, I don't think this live-action adaptation ever really intended to create a faithful or realistic adaptation of the Archie comic characters. If you ask me, the usage of these names and characters was probably to help sell the show to the network, not even sell it to audiences, because most of the target demographic probably never read Archie comics beyond a few pages while taking a poop at a relative's house. Which leads me to the second point. The familiarity of the characters, not the reading on the toilet thing. The namesake of these characters has nothing to do with them being reinvented or reimagined to be darker and edgier. It's about character archetypes. Archie, Betty, Veronica, Jughead, and their peers are ubiquitous in the Western zeitgeist. Pretty much everyone is familiar with their names and faces, but that doesn't mean that they are familiar with the details and minutiae of the story. They are familiar enough that people know the basics of each of them and their relationships with each other. Audiences understand the archetype that the characters represent, but beyond that there isn't much else. This makes these characters perfect vehicles to tell stories with very little effort in character development, particularly if you're going to subvert these archetypes, because the younger viewing demographic is generally not as attached to these characters as their elders might be. They just recognize them and what their archetypes are. Look at the way Riverdale introduces its characters. There is an immediate shorthand for who each of these characters are, but because of the fantastical dark drama setting, the show can then distort and subvert the archetype. Betty was the pretty and kind girl next door, but now she has a demanding mother and unrealistic expectations placed on her, which causes her to act out, sometimes sexually. Veronica was the beautiful and rich heiress, but now she's this vulnerable new girl who's been cut off from her father's money, and instead of her mean streak, she attempts to make friends with Betty. It's not hard to see how these archetypes would fit into a darker setting. The ideas make sense if you realize that the show only cares about the characters' names insofar as it can play with their archetypes, and then it just dials the crazy up to 11. The inconsistency of these characters is part of the same phenomenon as well. Character archetypes have vaguely outlined motivations, so there's a general sense of direction, but it's easier to just explain in every scene what the character wants. And the show does this through its strange blend of surrealistic line delivery and unironic word choice. The shit that comes out of these kids' mouths is absurd. Nobody talks like that! But because they're not real people, they're just moodier versions of cultural archetypes, they're only superficially associated with their namesakes, and so it can get away with this kind of weird dialogue. Betty's reaction when Veronica is first introduced is spot on.
Are you familiar with the works of Truman Capote? I'm breakfast at Tiffany's, but this place is strictly in cold blood.
No 15-year-old talks like that. If someone in grade 10 came up to you and said that, you'd think they were a fucking serial killer. You know what? I wouldn't put it past this show to have her actually be a serial killer. But because of these archetypes, they'd have to say their intentions in every scene. I'm not sure how I would glean their intentions from a scene if they didn't, because they're often in contrast with what they wanted in the previous scene. It's a strange choice to go in this direction with these characters, but it's not as though these stylistic choices aren't traceable. Riverdale may be the crown jewel in the CW's current selection of TV shows, and only time will tell if it will have the same kind of lasting impact as some of the network's other shows. Although in a lot of ways, Riverdale is a product of the legacy of those other shows. For those who don't know, the CW was formed after CBS and the WB network were both closed and partnered to create a new network, which was named after parts from both of the old network names. This is important because the legacy of both of those networks and the shows they created were inherited by the CW. Some of these shows actually moved over to the new channel where they continued their life, like Gilmore Girls and Veronica Mars. But over the last decade and a half, the CW has solidified itself as a network that aims its programming at young adults and teenagers, between the ages of 14 and 25 if I had to make a rough guess. The network has been responsible for some huge runaway hits in that demographic, such as The Vampire Diaries and its myriad spin-offs, Gossip Girl, iZombie, and the now 7 or 8 superhero shows that are collectively referred to as the Arrowverse. The Vampire Diaries and Gossip Girl in particular were exceedingly popular with the female demographic, who seemed to respond to the moodier and sexier themes and characters. They were also both adapted from existing literature, so it's easy to see where the setup for Riverdale would come from. But outside the CW, another massively popular franchise occurred, a little show called Pretty Little Liars. It had the same sexy, darker tone to it, along with the lighting and camera filters that would become so ubiquitous. It also had an overarching mystery that was intercut by smaller scandalous events, all featuring rather unrealistically beautiful actors who were significantly older than the high schoolers they were supposedly representing. All networks pay attention to each other and what is popular in an effort to compete, but what Pretty Little Liars had done that had never been accomplished before was move the fandom to the internet. And of course the CW took notice. It was online that every episode was discussed, and the overarching mystery could be dissected and excruciated over by like-minded people. And so it follows that when Riverdale was in development, it ticked off all the boxes of the popular dramas that came before it. A very loose adaptation of literature with reworked characters that matched the dark and shiny new direction with impossibly good-looking actors playing at high school characters. And of course, the central plot focus of the first season is a murder mystery. Top that off with the fact that the show was simulcast on Netflix for convenient rewatching and binging, and you have a show that was designed for the young adult, internet-savvy female. Riverdale is a show and fandom that largely thrives on forums and threads on Reddit and other websites. Most of the best criticisms that are aimed at the show and its characters come from fans in these places. The terms hate watch and guilty pleasure are probably extremely accurate for a lot of these fans because the ridiculous and cringy nature of the show is what makes it so much fun to be a fan of, and adds fuel to the joy of arguing with strangers on the internet. Plus, if you watch something ironically, you still get to watch it. A lot of the hate that was initially directed towards Riverdale was because of what might be called an appropriation of beloved characters into a new direction. But a part of that anger was also informed by the fact that the show was clearly intended for a young adult and teenaged female audience. In the West, art directed at females and especially young females is often looked down on as lesser art, which is really fucked up. It's the same kind of reaction that people had when males became interested in My Little Pony, of which I covered in another video. If you want to hear more about this, go check out my video or this amazing video essay Lindsay Ellis did on Twilight. This dedication or borderline obsession with Riverdale and some of its predecessors amongst fans, and the general disdain for lack of cohesive writing reminded me of another form of television. One that has long remained a staple of the television landscape since its inception and continues to run today. One whose popularity has not gone unnoticed and has been slowly seeping into the drama series we all watch, and probably nowhere is this more obvious than on the CW. Because Riverdale is a soap opera. And I don't mean that as a derogatory term for the show, I mean it's literally a soap opera in terms of its form and function. As I alluded to, soap operas have been hugely popular in television all over the world. In the USA, shows like Young and the Restless and Bold and the Beautiful have been going since 1978. In Spanish-speaking countries, the telenovela is hugely popular, and let's not forget that the UK's Coronation Street started in 1960 and is still going. It airs like 6 days a week! Their popularity and longevity are undeniable, and as I already mentioned, networks pay attention to what is popular on other networks, and soap operas seem to work. So of course, networks would capitalize on that and shoehorn those ideas into their own shows. But first they'd have to figure out what makes soap operas work so well. Luckily, we have the benefit of academic scholarship and a dude named Robert Clyde Allen. In his book, Speaking of Soap Operas, Allen outlines one of the reasons that soap operas work so well. It also happens to be the same reason that critics turn their noses up at the idea of them. Soap operas are designed to never end. They are typified by an ever-expanding middle in which stories are developed but never resolved, and only a few people are ever allowed to be happy at any given time. Because of the nature of this production format, events and characters appear to have inconsistent writing. The narrative seems to meander and the themes are arbitrary. This is partially because conflict needs to be consistently iterated upon and cannot be resolved in any meaningful way or lead to any character growth lest the plot end, which is besides the point. Soap operas aren't designed to end. They're designed to continue in perpetuity, so viewers build a kind of infinite parasocial interaction in a kind of creepy Truman Show-esque eternity, until that character gets too happy and he or she is killed off. But by then, audiences will hopefully have at least one new character to latch onto, until that old character gets revived for the sake of eternal conflict. That evil sister who tried to steal your baby and ended up falling off a roof by accident? Surprise, bitch! She's back! Many scholars note that drama series have also begun to take part in this ever-expanding middle, sometimes to their detriment. The goal of Western television for a long time now has been to keep a show going rather than tell a specific story, and often that's why shows end on sour notes, because the never-ending middle detracts from the point of the story or begins to take its toll on the characters. The fact that K-dramas don't do this is a big reason why they're so dope, by the way. But most drama series do eventually end. The production on shows like Riverdale is far bigger than your average soap opera, and so conclusions do happen. But that is fine because you can always get a spin-off with the chilling adventures of Sabrina and Katie Keene, and apparently there's a third one in production too now. The other point that Alan makes is that because the soap opera does not have a developed structure the way other works do, it defies conventional artistic criticism. Works of literature, prose, film, and television are scrutinized and praised based on how well they present their narratives and themes. This can only be done when a conclusion is presented. In the episode on Futurama that I just did, I presented the idea that the ending of a show that is heavily based on narrative storytelling can have the entire journey and its themes ruined by an unsatisfactory finale. It is only at the point of the conclusion that the reader or viewer can contemplate the themes and story and decide if and how the themes and narrative presented were satisfactory or not, even if the conclusion is subversive. But with the lack of a conclusion, no such critiques can be drawn. The only other option is to try and parse a show out into arcs, but this is messy and is an ad hoc method of attempting to give a show structure when none is meant to be derived. That means that when Riverdale does end, it will be subject to more criticism because the show will have some kind of conclusion, and based on the writing of the show, it will be impossible to wrap up any kind of dramatic through line or theme. If I had to hazard a guess, the only way out would be to go even crazier than the rest of the show, like the whole thing was some kind of post-apocalyptic drug-induced coma during a simulation of a dream during a flashback. Drama series also seem to have inherited the same female-targeted derision as soap operas, so that's a fun side note. But this is where I think most of the ire from the detractors comes from. The show is not consistent. It's incomprehensible in terms of traditional artistic criticism. The lack of trajectory isn't bad writing, it's absolutely the point of the show. Not only does it add to the unending development, but it provides more fodder for fans to expound upon online and in person. So yeah, Riverdale is a soap opera, and in the best way. Riverdale continues to shower its fans and haters with ever more ridiculous premises, and both groups continue to enjoy or rage in equal measure, and it's often unclear which group is which. But the show is exactly what it's supposed to be. It's a product of the lineage of shows that came before it, and continues the same dark aesthetic as its predecessors by presenting an unrealistic interpretation of character archetypes who happen to share their namesakes with identifiable characters for the purposes of creating a never-ending story. It defies traditional criticism because it has no ending as of yet, and even when it does eventually end, it will still have all the hallmarks of a soap opera in that it was designed to iterate on conflict but never resolve it. The result is a constantly increasing incredulity from the viewers as the show goes from bizarre to bonkers to downright ludicrous. And while I don't like the show, I definitely see the appeal. It's like a super surrealistic sexy train wreck in slow motion, and every week you come back for more. Well, you do, I don't. Of course, the show is still going to be maligned for its lack of attention to traditional filmmaking craft and its poor handling of characters, but that is most definitely part of the fun of the show. It's fun to hate on, and as I've said, the diehard fans are probably the people who love to hate it the most. And if there's no such thing as bad art, then let them love hate. It's not hurting anyone, and it seems to bring a kind of morbid joy even. Besides, I'm not sure we will ever get a show that is quite so uniquely trashy. And that is why I think Riverdale is as purposefully smart as it is ridiculously stupid. Here are my stray thoughts. I do think it's interesting to watch the expanding middle take over a lot of shows, and not just on the CW. I think for stereotypical dramas it works quite well, but not so much in their superhero shows, and even in the dramas it can be taken to the extreme. For the record, I do actually like some of the CW shows. I'm a big fan of Gilmore Girls, and in more recent years I really liked No Tomorrow and Life Unexpected, both of which were cancelled. Well, you either get cancelled while you're still cool, or you're on air long enough to see yourself become boring. Hey! Thanks so much for checking out that episode. Riverdale is still probably one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen, and yet everyone seems to love watching it, or love to hate to watch it. I don't know. Apparently now some of the characters have superpowers. I still have no idea what's going on in that show, but whatever. Don't forget to check out our other channel, the Cinemasters, for more conversations about movies, and subscribe and hit that like button so you'll never miss another episode of The Long and the Short of It, This Is a Thing, and anything else we got going on right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.